So this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to be covering quite a bit of stuff. So I'm going to try to get through all of this and then leave a lot of time for questions so we can have a discussion kind of according to your interests. So I'll pose some big questions by way of introduction, some definitions, and then what I want to do is talk a little bit about China's national ocean strategy, because this, a lot of people are familiar with the One Belt, One Road initiative, the 21st century Maritime Silk Road, but not a lot of people realize that that initiative has, the maritime portion of it actually has a very long history, and I think that context is very important when we're thinking about China and global ocean governance. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about African maritime strategy and kind of the developments that have happened in Africa along those lines. And then as kind of a case study for China's involvement in Africa, I'm going to look at some of the China's fishing activities off the coast, mostly of West Africa. And then we'll talk a little bit about the 21st century Maritime Silk Road and the port developments. And then we'll end with some policy implications for all of this. And hopefully as a foundation for some of the discussion that we can have, which I think will be pretty rich. Okay, so to start off with, I want to just get us all on the same page about maritime security and what I mean by this term. So maritime, kind of obvious, connected with the sea, it tends to have a connotation of being related to shipping and also military. And then for security, it's defined as being the state of being free from danger or threat. And in the international relations material, there tend to be two different types of security. One is the traditional security, which deals with the survival of the sovereign state. So this is all about, how states are using their military forces to protect themselves, and also economic interests insofar as they're serving national interests and protecting those economic interests. And then there's another term called non-traditional security, which really deals with issues of human security like food security, environmental issues. And another term for these is, hard security and soft security. And in the past, there's been, I would say, a little bit of maybe discrimination between these two camps, where the traditional security people are saying, oh, the non-traditional security stuff doesn't really matter as much. But in truth, these two things are actually very well connected. And I think one really good example is the Somali piracy, and of course the extent to which the piracy is due to disenfranchised fishermen, that's been debated, but there is some evidence that at least some of that piracy is because of people being displaced from their traditional fishing grounds. Another really good example of the interconnectivity of these two types of securities is in the South China Sea. I mean, that's a different topic. We're not going to cover that today, but a lot of the fishing activities has been very tied into kind of, the states there trying to enforce their claims over the maritime, the rocks and the territories there. So I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're thinking, for the rest of this talk about how some of these non-traditional security issues are actually exacerbating some of the traditional security issues. And I'll talk a little bit about that later and how they're kind of vying for attention. So I also want to mention that, I'm using maritime security because a lot of the literature says maritime security. I actually like to think of all of this as falling under the term ocean governance. It's a much broader term. Security is a little narrower, but ocean governance, also encompasses the international laws that we use to govern the oceans, thinking about how to manage scientific exploration. So all of that. So it's good to kind of think about this fitting into a pretty actually complex web of factors that we have to consider when we're thinking about the world's oceans. And it's a very interesting time, I think, right now to be studying the oceans. It's kind of, like aside from space, of course, which is the real final frontier, but oceans on the Earth are really kind of our last frontier. There's so much we don't know about the oceans. I mean, there's a lot of exploration that's still being done in the deep sea. And the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the big international treaty that governs oceans, that only entered into force like 20 years ago. So all of this is still playing out. As humans, as nations, we're still figuring out how to govern the oceans best. So it's interesting, thinking about China's role in African maritime security, but the bigger question is too, like, what's China's role going to be in the world? What's Africa's role going to be in the world? So it's important to keep that in mind. So some big questions here for us to think about. What are China's goals as a great maritime power? And they've stated they want to become one. What does that actually mean? Farther than Africa, I mean, what do they want to do in the Arctic? What do they want to do in the high seas? Those are all really big questions. And then another question a lot of people ask is China just going to protect its own national interests, or are they going to actually contribute to collective security and global stability? And if it's the latter, a lot of people bring up the question, well, if they become more powerful, are they going to try to change the current order? And this is not obviously just in the ocean field, but a lot of people are asking this in general with international governance issues. So, today, a lot of the governance and security of the commons is led by democratic powers. So the United States, the European Union. So a lot of people are wondering, well, what does it mean if that, kind of power and authority is shared with a state that's authoritarian? And then finally, what's the African response? What should Africa be thinking about? Not only its own maritime development, but also, how it fits into the rest of the world and what its role should be in global governance for oceans. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history of China's national ocean strategy, and then bring that up to the current period. So, a lot of people talk about the 21st century being the China century. Well, in China, a lot of people talk about the 21st century being the ocean century. And there's also references to the 21st century as being the century where, the ocean gives the most hope. So what does this all mean? What is actually China's interests in the ocean? Well, I think there are a few different motivations. Number one is economic motivation. And there are kind of two sub-motivations for that. The first one is China needs resources. It's a very resource-poor state. And so you see a lot of writing in Chinese about the ocean being, a source of rich resources that can supplement their lack of resources on the land. And then also there's some talk about the ocean being blue territory for China. And as the Chinese land-based economy has been slowing the last few years, China is turning towards its blue territory as a way to boost the economy. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ocean economy in a little bit. There are also scientific and technological motivations. I mean, a lot of exploration that's being done by China. The Jiaolong submersible. There's a new exploration vessel just being launched in Guangdong. Of course, there's military motivation. China's pursuit of becoming a sea power. And so some of you might be familiar with Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's the theorist who really talked about sea power in the 19th century and argued that big, powerful nations really need a navy to guard their commercial interests around the world. And so a lot of the Chinese writing talks about Alfred Thayer Mahan and developing sea power, and they too very much need to protect their commercial interests at sea. And then, of course, there's also an element of prestige and status here. So I think this quote from someone in the State Oceanic Administration really kind of captures this sentiment. And this is not just true in terms of China and the ocean, but in general, a lot of people in China see China's development as not a new thing where it's becoming powerful, for the first time, but really taking its rightful place back in the world. Because China used to be, a huge percentage of the global GDP, and it's only in the last couple centuries that it's decreased, and so it's really kind of coming back to its initial kind of position. And so, of course, a country like that should also be powerful around the world in terms of its ocean forces and naval forces. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over how the national ocean strategy has developed, and then into how it turned into the Maritime Silk Road today. So starting in the mid-1980s, the State Oceanic Administration, which is in the Ministry of Land and Natural Resources, they created an Ocean Development Strategy Research Institute. That's the name in Chinese, translated into English. And the English name, I think it's kind of funny. It's like a little more innocuous sounding, the China Institute for Marine Affairs. And then they launched a National Ocean Development Plan in 1991. Then it was kind of quiet for a little while in the thinking about ocean strategy until China ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1996. It was already entered into force around the world in 1994. And so they ratified it a couple years later. And then after that, you really see a lot of activity in China regarding the ocean. This was around the same time that China signed some bilateral fisheries agreements with neighboring countries, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. A lot more activity on the world stage is regarding this. So that's really kind of the turning point when a lot of activity starts to develop. Starting to address environmental issues. This is the the Agenda 21 was after the big Rio summit on the environment. And so China issued its own Agenda 21 to deal with the environment more generally, and then they also issued an Ocean Agenda 21 to deal with their environmental issues. You start seeing concepts of blue territory, blue economy mentioned in the literature in China. And then really in the beginning of this century, you start to see a lot at the kind of senior leadership level on developing the ocean strategy. So 2002, there's a call by the National Party Congress to implement ocean development. And then the State Council the next year, the State Council is China's executive branch, essentially. So they're implementing these directives that come from the party leadership. So they issued this, National Ocean Economic Development Plan. 5 years later, at the National Party Congress, you see a call for developing marine industry. State Council also issues a plan for that. And then in 2012, and I think most people probably heard about this, Hu Jintao called for building China into a maritime power, amongst other things, just highlighting the importance of the marine economy in general and marine resources. And then Wen Jiabao, around the same time, also indicated that this was a pretty big moment in China's thinking about the ocean when they said that promoting ocean economic development, implementing an ocean development strategy is a great change in our country's strategic thinking. That's a pretty big deal for a senior leader to say something like that. And so we've, a lot of the events we've seen in the last few years, we're just talking mostly about Africa today, but you also see a lot of this in East Asia with a lot of the maritime disputes and everything. This is around that time when all that heated up again. And much of that was a reaction to some of these statements that the leaders were making. Okay, so I'll just go through this pretty quickly. So it just kind of continues. These developments kind of continue. There's a big reorganization of the administrative structure. China combined 4 out of its 5 maritime law enforcement commands into one, the Chinese Coast Guard. That made a lot of its neighbors pretty nervous. It's more powerful and more efficient. A new National Ocean Commission was created, and it's under some pretty senior leadership. So the CMC, that's the China Military Commission leadership. So you're essentially all parts of the government, the party, the executive, and the military are overseeing this. It's a way to kind of draw them together and coordinate their interests better. Just a massive reorganization of responsibility in the SOA to make it more powerful to execute some of these interests. And so then right before the Maritime Silk Road was announced, in Southeast Asia, there was a big fund that was announced by Wen Jiabao, who was the then premier. And then just a couple years later, you get the announcement about the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. So I think a lot of people, they kind of think about China's ocean policy as being, pretty recent with the Maritime Silk Road, but it's important to remember that there is this history, and this is just the kind of the latest iteration of that maritime strategy. And I would actually say too that it's really kind of a subcomponent of an overall strategy in thinking about China's place in global ocean affairs. So the Maritime Silk Road is, it's kind of geographically limited, but there will be questions about what's China's role going to be in other parts of the world, just beyond the parts that are pretty closely linked by landmass. Okay, you also see a lot of their thinking reflected in their 5-year plan. So China's on a 5-year plan system. They plan it's a very communist thing. It came from the Soviet Union. They plan their economic development in 5-year installments. So you see much more emphasis on this. Starting from 2001, there was hardly any mention. By the way, 2001 is when the going out policy was introduced. Do you all know what that is? Anybody not know what that is? Okay, so this is a policy that China promoted in 2001 that encouraged Chinese actors, Chinese businesses to go find markets and investment opportunities abroad. This is a very important policy. It doesn't just, relate to ocean. It's, a lot of the expansion that China's been doing, and this was behind a lot of the expansion of China into Africa. I mean, the new kind of like the newer period of expansion. I mean, China's been involved in Africa for a long time, but this like kind of new wave of investment really dates back to this going out policy and elsewhere around the world too. So then in these 5-year plans, you keep seeing more and more space devoted to ocean issues. I haven't counted up 2016 yet, how many characters it is, but but much bigger sections on blue economy. Also, interestingly, environmental protection is getting a little more attention in the most recent 5-year plan. We're on the 13th 5-year plan right now. And then what you also see, this is kind of a recent development, you're starting to see specific 5-year plans at pretty kind of detailed levels on fisheries, polar exploration, marine mining, marine standards, kind of more general, like maritime development. There's a National Ocean Economic Development 5-year plan that was just issued in May. And here's where, this is true of so many Chinese documents, the One Belt, One Road. Everyone's heard of One Belt, One Road, right? I'll talk about it a little more later. But in all of Chinese foreign policy documents now, you see mention of One Belt, One Road. And so it's true, kind of in their economic thinking too, that all of that has been, kind of pulled into this, Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road kind of foreign policy flagship catchphrase. Okay, so here's back to the marine economy. So China's actually made some pretty impressive progress developing its marine economy. It actually calls it its gross ocean product, GOP, different GOP. And it accounts for about 10% of China's overall GDP. What they're trying to do is, so a lot of the traditional sectors of the ocean economy were kind of like primary resource based. So fisheries, for example, they're just like fishing for the actual fish. And what they're trying to do with the development of a lot of these other industries is capture value added. So kind of moving up the value added chain, even with fisheries, doing more processing, stuff like that, because they want to, and it's just a road to development instead of just using the primary resources. So a lot of these different sectors are pretty new and pretty in kind of early stages of development. Okay, so let me turn now to talk about African maritime strategy, some of the developments and challenges. There's a much shorter history here. I mean, there's a lot of, I think, ocean history in Africa, but the kind of strategic thinking that China has demonstrated is, the history here is a little bit shorter. And I actually want to say, too, that around the world, other countries, just by the way, other countries are also developing national ocean plans. A lot of European countries are doing that. The United States also is developing a national ocean plan. They had, under the Bush administration, started, with like a national ocean council. So there's a lot of thinking around the world and other places too about what, like a national strategy is around the ocean. And like I said earlier, it's kind of complicated because you're drawing together very different sectors, very different types of people, very different issues. So Africa started to do the same thing. So you had the African Maritime Transport Charter, which was drafted in 1994, but it did not enter into force, and it was revised in 2010, mostly to include some environmental issues, and it still has yet to enter into force. And this is really just to coordinate maritime transport, navigation, ports. It's not very comprehensive. So then, a few years later, a few years after 2010, you had the 2050 African Integrated Maritime Strategy. Who's heard of this? Anybody know about this? Okay, good. Do they all know this already? So, okay. So this is a pretty long document. I think it's like about 50 pages or something. It was drafted in 2012, adopted by the AU in 2014, and it's a pretty comprehensive strategy. Talking about how to develop their ports and how to manage the exclusive economic zone around Africa, blue economy, environmental issues. I'll come back to what the challenges are, I guess. So on the heels of this, you have some summits to address some of these issues. The Yaoundé summit in 2013 was really about piracy, not so much of the other issues that were covered in that AIM strategy. They adopted a soft law code of conduct to address the piracy. There was a summit in 2015, which was really a meeting between the AU and the EU about maritime security and safety. Then the AU declared this decade, in 2015, this decade is the decade of African seas and oceans. And they have included blue economy as part of the AU Agenda 2063. Have you guys heard of that agenda? Yeah, so it's kind of a development agenda for the next 50 years. So then we get to a big summit in Togo in 2016, which was at the AU level. And they issued a charter, which is an attempt at a binding treaty for African countries to participate in to manage kind of the maritime sector. They defined blue economy. And then what's supposed to have happened is there were supposed to be technical groups that drafted annexes to this to talk about the details of the various aspects of the maritime plan. And those were supposed to be submitted to the AU. As far as I understand, that has not been done. That was supposed to be done just a few months ago in July. And I don't think that's actually happened. And so this kind of gets us into some of what the challenges are. So first of all, Africa's maritime issues are very dominated by piracy. That's really been the number one issue. I mean, first it was in, off the coast of Somalia, Gulf of Aden. There's still a lot of problems there, but that has actually pretty effectively been addressed. Now what's happened is a lot of that piracy has developed in the Gulf of Guinea, so on the other side of Africa, and there have been fewer resources to deal with the piracy there. So that Yaoundé summit in 2013 was very much addressing that. And it's a very real problem. It definitely hampers African economic growth, exports of oil, for example. And that's one thing that China's very interested in is importing oil from Africa, trade in general. So even though there's a lot of promise in Africa to develop a marine economy that could be very beneficial for Africa's development, it's still unfortunately very overshadowed by these security concerns. And again, they are interconnected, because if you've got people who are being disenfranchised by crime, by lack of development, and they have nothing else, they really have no other options but to seek maritime crime or seek some types of crime. And so it's kind of a negative compounding feedback loop. Actually, it's a positive feedback loop, but it's it's negative in nature. But it's a compounding feedback loop. And until that's addressed, it's very hard to move on to addressing some of the development targets that they have for the blue economy. The other thing is there's been a lot of issues coordinating all of this in the AU. So there's a task force that's supposed to be coordinating this. They got moved. They didn't get moved with their resources. They're in like the office of it's like the office of legal, like the law office of the AU. They got moved there, and they don't really have the staff. So a lot of the like the experts that are supposed to oversee this are just not in the right place to be able to actually do much. They're not very empowered to do anything. You've got questions about, okay, so what kinds of maritime enforcement patrols would you need? I mean, piracy is only one of the security issues. I mean, you've also got a lot of illegal fishing. Well, you don't really need navies to patrol illegal fishing necessarily. Coast guards might be better. Also, Africa doesn't have a merchant marine. So the merchant marine is it's essentially the people who man ships. And those people become auxiliary service people if in the time of war or anything. They're very skilled people. And if Africa wants to have a lot of shipborne trade, there's really no services that can actually provide the skilled personnel that you would need for that. So that's been a very big debate in Africa. It's like, well, I mean, navies are very expensive. Do you actually need a navy? Could you get by with a Coast Guard? How to coordinate all that, how to put all that into place has been very much an issue there. I kind of mentioned this earlier too, in the context of actually having a body to do this, but in general, there's some coordination challenges. So remember I mentioned the AIM strategy before. Well, this Lomé Charter it's in some ways a little bit redundant. I mean, it's a binding treaty, but it's less detailed than that AIM strategy was. And so, having some clear understanding of like, okay, what's the strategy for, what's the charter for, sometimes the terms that they're using are defined in different ways in each of these documents. So coordinating that has been a challenge. Coordinating all the organizations that are involved in this is very challenging. So not only do you have the AU level bodies that are working on this, but there's also all the regional bodies, and there have been new entities that are set up to help. In the case of the Gulf of Guinea with piracy, there's some new institutions that have been set up to help work on that. But there were already some existing institutions, so all of that needs to be ironed out, and that can be very challenging. Okay, so now I want to move on to fisheries. So China had, so this issue I think it's interesting because it really predates the whole Maritime Silk Road thing, and predates all of the recent activity in Africa that China's been leading. And I also think it's a very interesting case study because it's been around so long, we're actually seeing some interesting changes in how China's been approaching fisheries in Africa. So I'll get to that. But I think it's a good example for how Africa can respond to some of these challenges. All right, so this is a chart of global fish catch, wild capture fisheries, and you can see that China's share has just been getting bigger and bigger to the point that it's the world's largest producer of wild catch. Now, they've had actually a lot of problems in their own domestic waters with overfishing, and so they've turned to fishing in in the high seas, which belongs to nobody, and then also in the coastal waters of other countries, like African countries. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the distant water fishing industry is. Well, I just mentioned it's on the high seas and the exclusive economic zones of other countries. So exclusive economic zone is 200 nautical miles off your shore, and you have jurisdiction over the resources there. You don't control it. It's not sovereign territory, but you have exclusive access to those resources. And so China signs, it's not only China that does this, but countries sign access agreements to be able to get licenses to fish in those waters, which is what they do off the coast of mostly West Africa. So their industry started in 1985. They sent 13 vessels to West Africa to fish. So that's what I mean by it's been around for a while. It started out with big state-owned enterprises. There still are a lot of state-owned enterprises, but there's been a trend towards privatization, which is a problem because it can be a little harder to control, private companies. Today, there are 167 enterprises, 2,500 vessels. This is around the world, catching that much. But what's interesting, really, is how much the vessels, the fleet has grown in Africa. So it's gone from 13 vessels in '85 to over 600 today. And they caught, in 2015, the same amount of the total catch in Africa in 1950. Actually, this might be just West Africa. I should double check that. But the total catch, I think in West Africa in 1950, was the same as what just the Chinese are catching today. This is probably a vast underestimation of what they're actually catching, and I'll get to that in a second. But I want to talk really quickly about the drivers of the Chinese distant water fishing industry. So number one, it was a food security issue. Their own waters were very overfished, so they had to turn elsewhere to look for fish. There's very much an economic drive, especially employment. A lot of the domestic fishing industry was curtailed after the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea entered into force because China had to sign all those bilateral fisheries agreement that was mandated in UNCLOS to work out these fisheries agreements with your neighbors. So that meant a lot of unemployment in the domestic fishing industry. So China's been sending these unemployed fishermen out, around the world to kind of relieve that unemployment. Profit, any company was motivated by profit. Also just part of this ocean economic development plan, part of the going out policy. The going out policy actually names the fishing industry as one industry that should be going around the world and fishing around the world instead of in China's waters. And it's an expression of sea power, too, for China. And this is modeled after a lot of the big fishing nations, like in the 50s and 60s. So the Soviet Union had the biggest distant water fleet in the world, and they used their fleets for intelligence gathering. This was during the Cold War. And there's less evidence that China is doing that, but it's possible. And a lot of the technology that's used in a fleet that is powerful enough to go around the world can be used for military purposes. And it's highly subsidized, this industry. At least at the central level, it's about $6.5 billion of subsidies that goes to the industry. And then if you count the provincial ones, which is the data's a little spottier there, but it's about $8 billion a year that's going to their fishing industry. That's not just distant water fishing, it's all of it, but a lot of the distant water fishing industry is subsidized. So as I mentioned, it's the late 90s when UNCLOS is ratified by China, and that's when China starts sending a lot, like really kind of put some impetus behind China sending people around the world. And that's when you really see a lot of a large percentage of the catch is starting to go to fish that's caught elsewhere outside of China's domestic waters. So what are the challenges here? Okay, so in terms of international theory, which I don't know if that's interesting to people, but what a lot of people study, with countries' behavior is, are they actually, just complying with international laws, meaning like they're kind of checking the box, like, yeah, we're following this, or are they really cooperating with the spirit of the law? And what I would argue is, China largely abides by the letter of the law, but they're not really cooperating with the spirit of the law. And I guess there's some students here who are taking this as a seminar, right? So the paper that I sent out to you guys, it kind of talks about this a little more. And if anybody else is interested in that paper, I'm happy to share it with you. But so a lot of, and this is not just Africa, but around the world, China wants to seem like it's following all the international laws, but really in practice, it's often the case that they're trying to get away with as much as possible. So there are lots of problems with, data, reporting accuracy, the quality of the data. There was a study done by the University of British Columbia that showed that China was vastly underreporting its distant water fishing catch. The catch from Africa is probably 4 times higher than those previous statistics that I had up, and worth a lot more. There was a report by Greenpeace that found that Chinese were underreporting the gross tonnage of their vessels, because that means they get a different type of license. There's poor regulation. They're supposed to be using technology to monitor their position. In practice, a lot of that technology is turned off when they're actually operating. I mentioned the subsidies earlier. But the point here is this poses a lot of challenges for African food security. The coastal states in Africa rely very heavily on fish as a source of protein, and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in Africa is estimated to be 65% of reported catch. So you've got the reported catch, and then 65% of that, like on top of that, is unreported. Does that make sense? So the actual catch is it's 165%. You don't get that? Okay, so the catch that's going on in Africa, overall, I'm more familiar with just the statistics from China, but whatever number that is, there's another 65% of that number added to that total number, and that's the total amount of catch that's actually coming from African waters. Yeah, I probably could have written that a little better, but a lot of the catch is illegal, essentially. So what's the mentality of the Chinese here? And this is what I think has been interesting to see the kind of evolution in their thinking. So this is an article that came out in 2012, and what the article, it's in a, like a popular Chinese magazine, and what the article is showing is that, China is not a very powerful distant water fishing nation. And, it's very much calling for China to develop its industry more and, just be more kind of state of the art, cutting edge. And, if you look at how it's, depicted in the illustration here too, it's very, it's very tumultuous, and it's all about money and, like power. And the message in China then was like, we just need to expand this industry, expand, as much as we can, more subsidies at all costs. Now, the thinking has been changing over the last few years, which I find this fascinating. So in 2013, there were a couple articles that came out about distant water fishing in Africa. One was that UBC study that I mentioned, that showed that China was vastly underreporting its catch. And then another one was an article that I did. It's the one that I am giving to you guys as part of the seminar. And what I did in that article was really talk about some of the qualitative studies that the Chinese were publishing about the industry. And it really reflected this, notion of, okay, let's make sure we don't get in trouble with the laws, but let's try to catch as much as we can. There were some strategies in there, the Chinese had elaborated on, like, as to how to do that, how to kind of get around the quota and the licensing requirements. So the next year, one of my sources that I use for a lot of my research is this Chinese fisheries yearbook. So it comes out every year. It's like this big, thick volume. And it, every year it's got this, like section on distant water fishing. And it's got all the, statistics, what countries they're active in, how many vessels, what they're fishing for, blah, blah, blah. And, that's like, it's where you get the official statistics on the industry from China. So the 2014 yearbook, that section was just gone. And I was like, oh no, like they just like censored this information. We're never going to know anything now about what the Chinese are doing in their distant water fishing industry. And then the following year, there was the section was back. So in the 2015 yearbook, the distant water fishing section was back, and there was a new section in the yearbook on distant water fishing safety, supervision, and management. And so the Chinese never responded officially to, any of these articles. But this, maybe it's just a coincidence, but it's interesting to see them go from, before you would never see any admission by the government of China that there was any illegal fishing going on by representatives of their country. I even asked the fisheries minister at one point, so what do you think about illegal Chinese fishing? He's like, none of that goes on. And now you actually see some acknowledgement that, there have been some laws broken, and this is probably not comprehensive, but still, it's a start. There's some problems, that this could mean the damaged reputation of China's responsible fishing country. And then some responses, like how to deal with some of these problems. And then you also see less emphasis on expansion, like I mentioned earlier, in the most recent fisheries 5-year plan. So I think that's very interesting because, it shows that they're considering some of these, sustainability arguments about the industry and most likely some of the response from other countries about the actions they've been taking thus far. And then also, I'm looking into this a little bit more closely now. This is a pretty new organization, but there is a new West African Regional Fisheries Management Organization, which is, not all West African countries are a member of this, but it's attempting to coordinate the response of coastal countries in West Africa. And that could be very much a helpful way to, stop some of the stuff that's going on. Let me try to hurry up here a little bit. It's running out of time. Okay, so in terms of One Belt, One Road, I think you guys already probably know about this, but it was announced in 2013. There's the overland route through the Eurasian continent, and then there's the maritime route. They've got up to $1 trillion in funding. Africa in the past has not really been that emphasized in One Belt, One Road. I have a map on the next page, but there were a couple points, the port in Kenya and then Djibouti, are on the Chinese maps of the initiative But otherwise, this initiative was not really mentioned until 2015 at one of the FOCAC meetings. They kind of started to bring it up. But there have been a lot of other port projects announced. There's not that much information about, like, are these ongoing? I mean, some of them are definitely, we know a lot about the Bagamoyo port in Tanzania, but the whether these are actually going to all happen is still uncertain. They're expanding the Suez Canal in Egypt. There's one naval base right now in Djibouti, and then there are some rumors that there might be additional naval bases that are going to be built along the west coast of Africa and elsewhere in East Africa. So here's this is the over the land route, and then so here are the points in Africa that have been on the map, Djibouti and one in Kenya. But otherwise, there's not really been that much in terms, a lot of the Maritime Silk Road has been focusing on, South Asia and Southeast Asia. And then really, in general, a lot of the focus has been the land route. And more has just kind of been happening there, too. And it's also in part because it's more obvious on land. You see the changes more, whereas the maritime route it's you're building ports, but other than that, there's not that much of a physical change. Okay, so policy implications. Just kind of some conclusions here, maybe some discussion jump-off points. So Africa can probably borrow some from China's ocean planning. I mean, China, there's been kind of mixed record of success in some of their plans, but they do have some interesting developments in like marine spatial planning, for example, that I think even the United States could actually learn from because they've kind of done more in that area. Epistemic communities. So when Chinese officials, academics are engaging with, scientific communities around the world and kind of exchanging ideas and knowledge, that the Chinese will bring that knowledge back, and that kind of works its way into the policy system. And I think we've seen some of that. And also, reputation costs matter. I mean, China does not want to be seen as a country that's exploiting other countries. So I think there's some indication from the fisheries case study that I just talked about that maybe some of this stuff is actually happening. And there are other case studies in other aside from the maritime realm that show this too. So it seems like what's really important in terms of African interest is having a coordinated and strategic response to all this. For the African community to think carefully about how they can leverage this to their own advantage. And also, diversification of actors matters too. Like having lots of people participating in maritime sector development is great, just, to kind of counterbalance some of these interests. China, a lot of people claim that China is really just interested in extracting resources from Africa. Well, they've participated in some of the anti-piracy efforts, and they can do things like provide Coast Guard kind of guidance and other governance partnerships. There's a model, well, I won't really go into this, but the US and China have a Coast Guard partnership that's been very successful in the North Pacific. So stuff like that could be an interesting way forward. This is true about One Belt, One Road in general, but there's still a lot of unknowns about this. Like how is this really being financed? What projects are really going to be enacted? And there's some pretty grand plans that are being laid out by the Chinese government, but whether all of that comes to fruition still remains to be seen largely. And I think that's true about the Maritime Silk Road. I mean, the research I was doing trying to find some more information about the ports, it's unclear, what the status is for some of them, like whether some of them are actually going to be built, what the financing is. For some of the ports, the financing is, the governments are just paying Chinese companies. And in that case, that's another question I had. But yeah, in that case, it's maybe not such a big deal that a Chinese company is building a port if it's just being, paid by an African government. I think one of the questions a lot of people ask, kind of from a theoretical lens, is, well, does this mean that it's a realist, like kind of state-to-state competition over resources, or is the Maritime Silk Road and the One Belt, One Road more generally going to actually be, result in genuine free flow of trade and connectivity of, capital flows and education opportunities and ideas. So I think that's a big question, kind of in the international relations community. And then, like I said earlier, maybe the ports maybe they're not quite as worrisome. Naval bases, I could see people bringing up some issues with that. But anyway, so these are just kind of some thoughts that I'd seen reflected in the literature, some thoughts that I had, and that is it.
Yeah.
Thank you.